So I'm going to repeat the advice about the literature review again, and maybe add a little bit more. Your literature review should not just be a collection of 3 contributing factors, especially if your research is only about one of them. All right. So, but the stuff from your qualifying exam that was about the overview of the nature of the problem might be useful in your literature review. Okay, number one. Number two, you need to be sure to cover the prior research on this exact topic. So if it's about one contributing factor, for example, then you would really highlight that contributing factor. You might even have to do a little more reading. Number two, you need to identify and define the main constructs, so be sure to do that. And number three, and this is something that I think is a little bit hit and miss in your conclusion paragraph, but for sure, go back and look at your conclusion paragraph and make sure you identify a need for additional study or analysis. And this is, sort of the research gap. But it could just be that you need to study it in your context. So what that means is you may have to take out some contributing factors that have very little to do with your study, and you might have to do a little bit more reading. But I will have you know that ultimately your dissertation, which would hopefully be a continuation of an expansion of what you're studying in your pilot study, will benefit from fleshing out more about this particular contributing factor or whatever it is you're doing. And I also want you to know that if whether or not I've gone in and given comments yet on your lit review and intro, you can make these changes, right? Because it's a Google Doc, it's a living document, so feel free to go in there this week if you want and make some of these changes. And if I haven't given comments, I would love it if you would go in and make these changes. The other thing to check about your lit review, and again, this is a repetition, but now that you've been trying to hone it, this will help you. So go back in and look at your lit review and make sure that the lit review and the introduction and the research question all focus on the same key constructs so that you're not throwing a random one in just because it was one of your contributing factors. Also, that you have brought in the context, so the place, the who, like what kinds of students, and the what, right? That you've defined those and you've brought those up. Thank you, Allison, for your question. Let me offer up a little bit of clarification. The literature review of a pilot study should be aimed at the research question. That's why I put the research question here. So not, and I can definitely see the confusion when I say to talk about your context. I don't mean your context, like you wouldn't talk about your school where you're doing your research, but general research on the context. So you would need general research on what is an alternative, or at least define what an alternative education setting is, define what marginalized students are considered, define what project-based learning is. So it's not, it's what's in the literature about these things that you're researching. So if you're researching higher education or Hispanic serving institutions, you're going to define it using the literature. Later in the methods is when you talk about your specific context and the specific who that you're talking about. So thank you for that question. That was a very good question. Hopefully this will clarify.